Have you ever been betrayed so deeply, so personally, that your entire body shook with rage? I'm talking about the kind of disrespect that makes your chest tighten, your pulse race, and your hands tremble as you decide right then and there that you will not let them walk away unscathed. That's exactly what happened to me when the man I once dated decided to give out my number to strangers. For money. What he thought was a joke turned into the kind of revenge story that still makes me laugh years later. Before I dive in, let me know in the comments if you've ever dreamed of getting revenge on someone who crossed the line. Hit that like button if you believe in karma, and subscribe if you love hearing real stories where justice gets served in the most unexpected ways. You know that old saying love makes you blind? I used to laugh at it. I thought it was just a cliche people threw around after bad breakups to excuse poor judgment. But looking back now, oh, I was blind. Willingly blind. And the man I dated, let's call him Derek, wasn't just a mistake. He was a life lesson wrapped in arrogance, laziness, and audacity I didn't know a single human being could carry. When I first met Derek, he seemed harmless. He wasn't some slick talker or overly charming player. If anything, he was just there. Average in every way, except for that smug little grin he wore like he'd just been crowned king of the universe. That grin should have been my first red flag, but I ignored it. I told myself don't judge a book by its cover. Big mistake. Derek was 26 years old and still living with his parents. Now, let me be clear. Living at home isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it makes sense. Life is expensive and not everyone has the same opportunities. But in Derek's case, it wasn't necessity, it was comfort. He had no job, no clan, no goals. His daily routine consisted of waking up at noon, playing video games, scrolling social media, and occasionally hitting the gym, not for health, but so he could flex in the mirror and post shirtless selfies and me. I was in my mid-20s, working full-time, paying rent, hustling hard to build a future. I didn't need someone rich or successful, but I did want ambition. I wanted someone who at least tried. Derek, he wasn't even in the ballpark. Still, I kept giving him chances. Maybe because I was lonely, maybe because I was tired of dating apps. Or maybe because I thought I could inspire him to get his act together. That naive little voice inside me whispered, maybe he just needs someone to believe in him. Spoiler alert, Derek didn't want a cheerleader. He wanted a babysitter. The more time I spent with him, the clearer it became. If his mom didn't cook, he ordered takeout. If his dad didn't nag him, he wouldn't even take out the trash. He had excuses for everything. I'll get a job soon. The economy sucks. I don't know what I want to do yet. I'm waiting for the right opportunity. All just empty words while he sat on his ass day after day. After 2 months, the rose-colored glasses weren't just slipping, they were shattered. I realized I was dating a man who saw no problem in being a parasite. And the kicker? He acted like I was lucky to have him. Like his bare minimum was some priceless gift dot, so I dumped him. No theatrics, no drawn-out explanations. Just, this isn't working, we want different things, goodbye. I expected anger. I expected maybe some begging, maybe some trash talking. But what I didn't expect, what I couldn't have expected, was the level of pettiness he had waiting. For me, it started innocently enough. A few days after the breakup, I was curled up on the couch, binge-watching Netflix. My phone lit up with an unknown number. Normally, I let those go to voicemail, but something tugged at me to pick up. Hello? I answered cautiously. The voice on the other end was a man, low and hesitant. Is this my name? I frowned. Depends. Who's asking? There was a pause, then he cleared his throat. Okay, this is gonna sound weird. But Derek gave me your number. He said you'd be down for a good time. I asked him like 3 or 4 times if he was serious because honestly, I thought it was too good to be true. But he swore up and down you'd be cool with it. He said you'd do it for $100. Is that okay? I froze. My stomach dropped, then flipped, then burned like fire. My ears buzzed as my brain tried to process what I'd just heard. $100. I repeated, my voice sharp with disbelief. Yeah, the guy said quickly, like he was rushing before I'd changed my mind. Cash, no strings attached. Just a good time. The world tilted. Derek, my ex, had given my number to some random man, telling him I'd sleep with him. For money? Rage thundered through me. My hand tightened on the phone. My face flushed hot, and I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears. Are you serious right now? I snapped out. The man hesitated. So, that's a no? No, that's a fuck off. I barked and slammed the phone down, my chest heaving. I sat there shaking, staring at my phone like it was a bomb about to explode again. My thoughts ran wild. Why would he do this? What kind of sick, twisted mind thinks this is funny? Humiliation wrapped itself around me like a vice. I wasn't just angry, I was violated. My private number, my identity, reduced to a cheap punchline in Derek's pathetic attempt at revenge. At first, I thought maybe it was a one-time thing. A disgusting prank. I considered calling Derek and unleashing hell on him, but I knew better. That's exactly what he wanted, to see me furious, to know he'd gotten under my skin. So I swallowed it down. I told myself, ignore it, it won't happen again. I was wrong. The next night, my phone lit up again. Another unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered this time. The voice was raspy, ancient sounding, like the man on the other end was 100 years old. Yeah, he croaked. Derek said you'd, spend some time with me. He said $50 would do it. $50. Not only had Derek passed my number around like a business card at a strip club, but now he was slashing my so-called rate like I was on clearance. I sat there, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles went white. The room spun with a cocktail of fury and humiliation. My throat burned with words I couldn't force out. Finally, I managed a trembling. Was this number now? I hung up, my hands shaking, my whole body buzzing with rage. That was the moment everything snapped, because here's the thing. Derek didn't just disrespect me. He tried to humiliate me. He tried to reduce me to nothing more than a dirty joke among strangers. And if I did nothing, if I just sat there and let it slide, he'd win. I couldn't let him win. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a promise to myself. If Derek wanted to play games, then fine. But he had no idea who he was dealing with. That was the night I stopped being a victim, and it was the night I started planning his downfall. For the first few days after those calls, I tried to keep living like nothing had happened. I showed up for work, I answered emails, I stood at the coffee machine and pretended to care about Karen's weekend plans. I smiled when people smiled. On the outside, I was composed, competent, professional. But on the inside, I felt like glass cracked, brittle, ready to shatter at the slightest nudge. There's a strange kind of exhaustion that comes from being humiliated. It isn't the same as being tired from a long day. It's heavier, deeper fatigue that sits behind your ribs and presses down on the lungs. When you're ashamed, you become hyper-aware of every little thing. The way people look at you, the tone in their voices, whether they whisper when you pass. I found myself flinching when my phone buzzed, checking every new text 3 times slower just in case it was another stranger asking how much I charged. I started thinking about who might have my number besides Derek. Had he given it to friends too? To his cousin? To someone who works at the bar we went to? I pictured my face, my name, tossed around like a cheap item at a garage sale. Work became harder. When I was in meetings, my hands would go numb from clenching under the table. I would catch my reflection and feel small, my hair too plain, my jacket too boring, my laugh not loud enough to drown out the humiliation. At night, I would wake at 3 in the morning and stare at the ceiling, and a dozen imagined scenarios would run through my head. What if one of them called my workplace? What if my boss saw my name in a message thread? What if my family found out my mom, who'd always loved me like I was made of glass but polished, who would never understand why someone would treat me like this? I told a couple of close friends, the ones who knew me, when I was messy and brilliant and heartbreak prone, and their reactions were a mix of disbelief, fury, and, thankfully, strategy. My friend Priya sat on my living room floor, legs crossed, a blanket around her shoulders, her face set in that fierce way she gets when someone breaks her code of decency. "This is vandalism of your privacy," she said, punctuating each word like a judge handing down a sentence. "He gave you away like you were a thing. That's not just petty, that's cruel. But what am I supposed to do?" I asked, the question whisper soft and ridiculous, even as I said it out loud. Call him and scream? File a police report? I don't even know if that would do anything. He'll just laugh at me. He loves that. Priya shook her head. He's getting off on it. The only way he stops is if he's embarrassed in return. He needs to feel the same kind of exposure. Think small, think effective, not violent. You aren't going to ruin him, but you can definitely make him uncomfortable. We schemed that night like conspirators in the best kind of heist movie. We tried to be rational, call his parents, maybe, and tell them what he'd done. But the more practical ideas we threw around, the more I realized how small they felt compared to the size of the injury. Calling his mom felt petty and weak. Filing a report felt like handing the problem to a system that would, at best, sigh and at worst shrug. I wanted something that landed where it hurt, his ego. The nights got longer. The calls slowed but didn't stop. Sometimes it would be a voicemail asking if I was available, sometimes a text that just said, "You up?" with a number I didn't recognize. I deleted them before friends saw. I changed my voicemail greeting to something neutral and uninviting, but that didn't stop the secondhand humiliation, the knowledge that somewhere someone was telling the story of me like a punchline. There were practical consequences too. I started to carry myself differently in public. I'd feel someone's eyes linger a beat too long, and my mind would jump to the worst case scenario. I caught myself avoiding places Derek might go. The bar where we'd had that first awkward date, the coffee shop he'd recommended, the corner store. It was absurd because these places had nothing to do with him anymore. But once something like that seeds itself in your head, it grows rows of irrational fences. I felt ridiculous, and that was its own kind of insult. He had made me small and then expected me to stay that way. I refused. But for a while, refusing felt like a political act, like I had to rally all my dignity and motivation and paste them on like armor every morning before leaving the house. One afternoon, 2 weeks after the first call, I nearly lost my composure at the grocery store. I was standing in the cereal aisle trying to decide if I wanted to be healthy or nostalgic, Cheerios or Cocoa Puffs. Why is adulting like this? When my phone lit up with an unknown number, I felt that old familiar spike of terror in my stomach, and my hands went clammy. I put the phone back in my pocket and told myself to breathe. I looked up, and there, less than a foot away, was Derek, in his favorite hoodie, scrolling through his phone like he owned the entire 10-foot radius. My heart plunged. For a moment, I had an urge I couldn't name y'all. Run, throw cereal boxes. Make a scene so big security would escort him out and he'd finally know what it felt like to be exposed. Instead, I locked my jaw and pretended I didn't see him. He didn't see me either. He was averting his eyes like a coward. I realized then how much of his bravado was a front. Up close, he looked smaller, the grin less triumphant and more brittle. I went home shaking. The proximity clawed at me. If he had seen me, if he had recognized me and thought to himself, there she is, the woman I used as a joke, it would have been worse than any anonymous call. He could have sought me out, confronted me, laughed in my face. The thought of him gloating sent a cold flurry through me. That night, I barely slept. I paced the apartment at 2 a.m., staring out the window at the sleepy city while the hum of distant traffic sounded like a second heartbeat. I replayed every moment we'd shared, not because I missed him, but because I needed to inventory everything. I cataloged the small indignities I tolerated, a canceled date here, a brag about not applying for jobs there, a refusal to split the bill that he insisted was my treat. Each memory was a tiny beam I could use to erect a blueprint of who he really was. Selfish, lazy, entitled, a man who thought he could barter with my dignity. And then came the doubt. Maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe it wasn't a big deal. Maybe people do stupid things. I hated that voice, the one that tried to convince me I was making mountains out of molehills. That voice was the product of a lifetime of being polite instead of furious, of smiling when I wanted to scream. That voice had kept me quiet for too long. The turning point wasn't one single thunderclap. It was a slow, decisive accumulation of small moments that snapped into place. I realized the humiliation wasn't the only thing at stake. It was the message. If I let Derek reduce me to a punchline and move on, I was giving him permission to do it again, maybe to someone else, maybe to me in another form. I wasn't going to teach him that lesson. That realization didn't make the anger go away. If anything, it sharpened it. The rage became focused, less volcanic, more surgical. I wanted him to feel the specific kind of discomfort his actions had caused me, to have his chest tighten every time his phone lit up, to feel that small, humiliating panic when he realized the world could see the gap between who he thought he was and who he actually was. But even while I felt that resolve hardening in me, fear remained. What if I did something illegal? What if I crossed a line and got in trouble? What if I made it worse for myself? The rational part of my brain, the one that pays bills and remembers birthdays, kept whispering caution. I had to balance righteous anger with consequences. I wanted revenge, but I also wanted to be smart about it, so I did the only thing I could think of that felt both safe and effective. I researched how to hit someone where it would sting most without getting arrested. I scrolled through forums like a sleuth, looked up stories of petty revenge, and read about ways people had exposed cheaters or liars. Some of it was obviously too much: doxing, blackmail, harassment. I crossed those off immediately. I wasn't a monster. I just wanted him put back in the box he'd come out of, and then, buried under a mountain of wild ideas, I found something that made my stomach flip equal parts thrill and terror. A plan so simple it felt like a joke, and so humiliating it fit perfectly into the geometry of my anger. It involved anonymity, a little deception, and the internet, the very thing he'd used to amplify his ego. I tested the idea in my head 100 times. I imagined him receiving messages, polite at first and increasingly presumptuous, asking for money, favors calls that would lead him to think he was finally getting the attention he'd so desperately wanted. I imagined him preening at the thought of being adored, then crashing when he realized he'd been conned. I imagined the exact moment he would delete his accounts and change his number, the way he'd feel when his fake world came crashing down. Every image made me a little giddy and a little ashamed of how gleeful I was allowed to feel, but planning felt different from acting. I wrestled with the morality of it, with the image of myself committing what my friends called petty vengeance. I wanted dignity, not a tit for tat that turned me into someone he could point at and call a villain. The problem was, he'd already made me the villain in his eyes, so my options were narrow. live small or push back, the doubt lingered. But so did the image of him standing in his kitchen, phone vibrating with messages from women asking if he could pay their rent. The fantasy calmed me like a lullaby. It felt fair in a way that legal action could not be. It felt like a lesson, not an act of brutality. I told myself one thing repeatedly as I lay awake thinking about how to proceed. This had to be done in a way that preserved my integrity. No threats, no public humiliation. Just a mirror held up to him so he could see himself clearly and, if he had the spine for it, change. I didn't expect change. I expected a man who cared more about his image than his values to crumble. That night, I made a decision. I would plan carefully. I would test things slowly. I would keep a record of every call and message just in case things escalated. I would protect myself. And I would make sure that whatever I did, it felt like justice and not revenge that made me into him. I didn't realize then how fine the line was between those two things. All I knew was that I had to stop being the person who woke up trembling at 3 a.m. because of someone else's cruelty. So I started preparing. I made a list silly, methodical, detailed, the kind of list that made me feel like I had control. Item 1, don't confront Derek directly. Item 2, don't do anything illegal. Item 3, use his own arrogance against him. Item 4, keep receipts. When I finally crawled into bed that night, my head was a buzz of schemes and checklists. Instead of the usual weight of shame, there was a new, brilliant lightness, the start of action. For the first time in weeks, I slept without that low, grinding fear locking my chest. Sleep came like a benediction, and as the dawn cracked over the city, I felt a small, wicked thrill. Whatever came next, I would be the author of it. I would stop being pushed around. I would force him to look at what he'd done. I just had no idea how addictive the power would feel. The next week felt like standing on a cliff, legs dangling, studying the wind. Every plan I made was a footstep I hadn't yet committed to. I told myself to be surgical, to be strategic, to protect my skin. I deleted the impulse buy ideas, the ones that involved public shaming or threats, and kept the ones that would sting but leave me unmarked. I wanted him to squirm. I did not want to be arrested. The plan I circled back to was the most childish, satisfying thing I could imagine. Use his own image and arrogance against him. Let him believe he'd found a pipeline of attention, let him preen, then let the rug be pulled. It felt like making a painting of him and then tearing it up in front of an audience. Immature? Yes. Effective? Probably. Moral? Debatable. Fun? Hell yes. That evening I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of tea gone cold while Priya watched me like a co-conspirator in a movie. You sure about this? She asked, not because she didn't support me, but because she knew how gossip feeds on people. This is a little theatrical. What else are we supposed to do? I asked. Call his mom and tell her he's a slimeball? Maybe, but this makes the point louder and it's contained. If it works, he deletes his accounts, changes his number, and lives in a more private, smaller world. That's the point. She sighed, but she didn't stop me. She brought me a notebook and a pen like a judge delivering a gavel. We hashed out logistics without getting into specifics I wasn't comfortable saying out loud. How to make the profile believable without being obscene. How to set communication so it funneled away from me. How to keep record screenshots, timestamps, because if the situation got ugly, I wanted proof this started with him. The receipts were part of my shield. The notebook filled with banal bullet points that somehow made me feel like a general planning and operation. Creating the profile was weirdly intimate. I hunted old photos of him close-ups where his nose looked just a little too proud, a smile that tilted to the right. The more I zoomed, the more I hated him, and also understood him, like an archaeologist cataloging the thing that had broken me. I cropped, I adjusted, I hesitated. For a brief second, I felt like a monster. Then I remembered the nights I'd stayed awake, listening for my phone, my throat tight with humiliation, and whatever twinge of guilt I felt washed away. The bio needed to be ridiculous tall claims, sweet-sounding generosity, the kind of language that would lure idiots who believed what they wanted to believe. Nice man seeking a woman to spoil and pamper. No strings attached. I've got money to spare and loads of it. If you're looking for help financially, hit me up. It sounded like satire when I read it aloud, but that's the point. Men like Derek get built on fantasy. People respond to fantasy. My hands hovered over the keyboard when I reached the contact field. I typed his number slowly, like it would evaporate if I weren't careful. Then I pasted the link to his Facebook profile in the more info section and paused to breathe. It felt obscene to hand him a megaphone and then flip the switch. But it also felt precise, like setting a trap with a perfect bait. Priya helped me craft initial messages short and coy, the sort that made men believe they were the catch instead of the catchphrase. She even wrote a few lines that I saved for posterity because God help me if this turned into something poetic. We set the account to private messaging only, no public posts. We would be the ghost behind the curtain, the prankster who never showed her face. Then I hit publish. The profile felt alive, pulsing like a heart I hadn't expected to feel. For a second, my stomach dropped. I performed an act that, in a different universe, might have had different consequences. But in this one, it was a delicate sphere of control I could pop any time. The first messages came within hours. Hey, handsome. From someone with a glittery profile picture. You look like my kinda guy. Read another dot. At first, I watched them with an odd dispassion, like a scientist observing a petri dish. The messages were repetitive. Compliments, coy offers, half-baked fantasies. Most were obvious bots or girls fishing for attention. I ignored them. The point wasn't to engage with anyone else. It was to nudge them toward his phone and his Facebook, the pieces of his identity I had left as bait. I started forwarding the best ones, those that mentioned money, rent, bills, help straight to his Facebook link, copying the text into the message box but never sending them from my real account. Instead, I used the fake profile to ping him indirectly, comments on his Facebook pictures, tags that didn't expose me but hinted at interest. It was a mess of small annoyances I was piling on, a slow drizzle of discomfort. Every time my phone buzzed with a new message to the fake account, I felt that little thrill, admiration, horror, satisfaction all swirled together. Some messages were ridiculous. Hey daddy, can you help me with rent? Some were brazen. I need $300 this week. Can you help? And some were just painfully earnest. I'm a single mom of 2. I lost my job. Could use some help. The range of tones made my stomach churn. It wasn't just his reputation on the line now. The lives and vulnerability of strangers were involved. I made a rule: no financial transactions, no real names, no public shaming. If the messages got too exploitative, I'd delete them and block the sender. I imagined his phone buzzing. I pictured him at the kitchen table, basking at the sudden attention, his chest puffed out as he checked each ping. I saw him typing responses with flawed confidence, promising help he didn't have. That image of him swaggering, then slumping, became the anchor for my slight dash of dash hand dog. A few days later, I noticed he was still active on Facebook. There he was in a photo with a buddy, beers in hand, captioned with a joke I'd heard 100 times before. He wasn't yet paying attention. Either he hadn't noticed the flurry of messages or he had, and they were flattering him into complacency. I could almost hear him telling himself he'd been lucky someone finally appreciated him. Everything felt fragile, like a house of cards I had only just started arranging. I would check the fake profile at random times, refresh the messages, copy the ones that sounded promising, forward them toward his profile. Sometimes I sat and watched for hours, feeling like a witch stirring a cauldron. The guilt came and went. I told myself this was a lesson. I told myself it was an equalizer. Mostly, I told myself I deserved it. On the fourth day, an unusual message landed. It was from a woman with an empty profile and one solitary photo, an older woman, mid-50s with tired eyes. Hi, can you help me with groceries this week? I'm behind and I have my granddaughter on Saturday. Her message tugged at something that wasn't even mine to tug. I hesitated. If this was genuine, it would have been cruel to play with it. I blocked the sender and moved on, flushing with shame. My plan was petty, but I didn't want it to be cruel. That night, I dreamed of the future, of the minute details of how he'd react. Would he answer his phone in front of friends, proud to show off? Would he hang up, feeling used? Would he change his number and delete his account in a panic? My imagination did most of the heavy lifting. I didn't want violence. I didn't want escalation. I wanted the slow consumption of his ego. I also wanted proof. If things escalated, I needed records. I took screenshots of messages of his Facebook activity, saved timestamps. It felt irresponsible to confess how much satisfaction that gave me, like a child collecting marbles. We savored the small victories privately. Priya and I would exchange glances when the fake account blew up with another ridiculous request. He's getting nervous, she'd say. Just wait. The weeks folded into a ritual. I'd check the fake account when I woke, before bed, and during lunch breaks. I learned the rhythm of the messages who wrote in the morning, who waited until late night hours when desperation makes people braver. Some nights I would sit with the messages and imagine alternate lives for the senders. They weren't my enemies. They were like me, imperfect humans searching for small comfort. After almost a week, something strange happened. The pattern tipped. I noticed fewer incoming messages. The fake profile's activity became a ghost town by comparison. When I refreshed his Facebook, the picture from last week was gone. The buddy's post was removed. A cold prickle ran over my skin like the moment before a storm. I called Priya, and she didn't even wait for me to breathe. Did you see? She whispered. See what? I asked, hurt lodged in my throat. He deleted the photo. His Facebook is less. Check it. My thumb hovered over the home button as if the screen were a live animal. I clicked on his profile. It looked thinner, hollowed out fewer friends, fewer posts, less bravado. Then, like someone slipping out a back door, the profile blinked, and for a heartbeat, there was a system message. This profile is unavailable. My stomach dropped. For a luminous second, triumph and dread tangled inside me. Had he noticed? Had he panicked and deleted everything? The image of him furiously deleting his digital life gave me a dizzy, childish joy. But joy was always paired with a tiny voice whispering, what if this goes wrong? What if he traces something back and I'm implicated? I breathed out slowly and reached for the last piece of the plan one. I promised myself I would only pull if it all looked safe. Calling his phone from an unknown number, the idea made my palms sweat. It was the final test to see if his number still worked, to see if the bait would reach him directly. I created a disposable number through an app, the kind of thing people use for yard sale listings or ride shares. I felt ridiculous, like I was about to prank a child. But this wasn't a child. This was a man who traded my dignity for a joke. I told myself if the call went to voicemail, I'd stop. If he answered, I'd keep it brief. No threats. No admissions. Just a small, controlled blow that would let me hear his voice and measure the damage. My heart hammered when I dialed. The world narrowed to the thin line between pressing the button and the moment someone picked up. I imagined him in his room, on his couch, maybe laughing with someone, maybe alone with his ego. The phone ring sounded like an ocean. It rang once, twice, on the third ring. A click, then his voice. Hello? Time folded. My mouth was dry. The script we'd practiced, the one where I'd play a bored sugar baby, felt silly and brittle in my throat. The temptation to scream, to tell him precisely what he was, to let years of indignation pour out, was immense. But I kept my voice low and steady like a professional lying on a stand. I wanted him to feel the same constricted panic I had felt when those men first called me. Hi, I said, the disposable number making my voice sound distant. Is this Derek? A pause, then a chuckle, a smirk I could almost hear. Maybe. Who's asking? I heard you like to help people, I said, keeping the flirtation light. I'm in a bad spot and could use some cash. 50 now, more later. You down? There was a rustle of fabric, maybe a roommate or a TV. 50? He asked, like the price was an opening bid to his vanity. Yeah, I can do that. His nonchalance twisted into something else, confidence that made bile rise in my throat. He sounded like he'd swallowed exactly the reaction he'd wanted. Cool, I said, keeping it casual. And nearby, can you send me $50 to payment app? I can come by. I watched the clock on my phone, counting the seconds that felt like hours. I imagined his hand hovering over his phone, the bravado turning to willingness. I could hear him for a second thick and pleased, then a cold realization that he might not have any cash to spare at all. That image, the empty bank account paired with his ego, made my throat tighten with a complicated, delicious ache. He said, yeah, sure. Hold on. I didn't hear the follow-through. Instead, in that soup of silence, I imagined the scene, him fumbling with apps, maybe lying about having the money, crafting excuses, the moment of exposure when he couldn't deliver. That would be the sound I wanted to bottle and keep. The sound of a man's chest deflating, and then something unexpected happened. His voice changed. He wasn't as smooth as before. Wait, he said, how did you get my number? My breath stumbled. For a second, I felt naked. He was fishing back. My brain scrambled for a cover story. I could invent anything, someone I met at a bar, a mutual friend, a wrong number. But the whole point of this call was to watch him twist. So I kept my answers vague, flirty, and disposable. Oh, I shrugged, the voice through the disposable line breezing like a curtain. A friend gave it to me. Anyway, I can text you where I'm at, he agreed. The call ended with a final, complacent sounding, all right, see you. My fingers hovered over the end button for the longest time before I hung up. The room was suddenly very quiet. I felt like I'd just lit the fuse on something and walked away, heart racing with equal parts fear and exhilaration. I sat back and let the adrenaline drain out of me. For a second, I thought, what if it works? What if he actually panics? What if he deletes everything and leaves me alone? Then another thought surfaced like a sting. What if it backfires? What if he traces the call? What if he had friends who were ugly and unrestrained? The line between satisfying and dangerous had never felt thinner. My phone buzzed, an alert from the fake account. A new message. Can you help me with rent? Another. Hey, handsome, saw your pic, can we talk? My pulse thudded like a drum. This was it. The pieces were in motion. I rested my head against the sofa, eyes closed, the city lights spilling across the ceiling like watchful stars. I had crossed into the part of the story I'd promised myself I could handle. Now someone else was walking onto my stage derrick, smug and unsuspecting. I could hear the distant echo of the first men's calls that had crushed me, replaced now with the hum of my own contrivance. It was intoxicating and a little terrifying. I thought of stopping them. I thought of confessing to Priya, of telling her to smash the whole thing if it got ugly. But part of me wanted to see it through, not because I wanted cruelty, but because I wanted to take back the narrative. For once, I wanted the power to be mine. My phone hovered over his Facebook link one last time, Then I opened the disposable dialer again. The number was still there. The record of the call glowed like a tiny, dangerous jewel. I pressed the call button. My heart slammed. The phone rang. And on the other end, before he could pick up, before any sound of bravado could be mustered, I heard a new noise. The faint, terrified tremor of someone realizing they were not as untouchable as they thought. The line clicked. I froze, every muscle taut, breath shallow, because I suddenly understood that this was no longer an experiment. This was the moment where everything I'd engineered either became a lesson or became a mess. My mouth tasted like metal. The world held its breath with me. Then his voice caught, smaller, said, "Who is this really?" And I didn't answer. I still didn't answer. I let the silence sit on the line like a weight, letting it stretch until it felt unbearable. For a second, the air in my apartment seemed to thicken my breath loud, the hum of the fridge a drum. I could hear my own blood in my ears. Somewhere in that thudding quiet, I heard him breathe, a small ragged exhale that sounded like someone catching on to the wrong end of a lie. "Who's this really?" he asked again, voice edged with something that was no longer confident, that had a thread of fear. I didn't have to say anything. Let him wonder. Let him imagine. Let him spin the possibilities like a wheel and never land. That tiny crack in his composure felt like the first splinter of a well-aimed strike. He swallowed audibly. "Listen, look, who gave you my number?" I let the pause hang. The power in those empty seconds was delicious. I heard the wheels in his head turning, the little cogs of ego and denial grinding. If he started naming friends, if he tried to triangulate, he'd only reveal his own arrogance. That is what I wanted, for him to frantically blame someone else, to tear at the fabric of his social life like a man desperate to stitch his image back together. Finally I spoke, not to taunt, not to confess, to close the door. "Wrong number," I whispered and hung up. The click was a punctuation that felt like a period ending a chapter. My chest unclenched a degree. I lay back on the couch, pulse still, racing, and allowed a laugh high, a little breathless, incredulous at what I'd just done. It was small, private, the sort of laugh that exists in the space between a scream and a sigh. What I hadn't expected was how quickly the consequences would show. Within an hour, my fake inbox pinged like an answering machine on steroids. Messages that had been trickling in steadily now arrived in a flood requests, bargains, pleas, obscene offers. I flipped through them with a detached curiosity, like someone reading the morning paper. There were dozens, probably hundreds. The volume was intoxicating because it meant the mechanism I'd set in motion had worked. The bait had been swallowed. I felt a surge of triumph, but it was tangled with an odd tenderness, an awareness that these messages were from real people. Some of the texts were cruel, some were sad. I deleted the ones that felt exploitative. I forwarded the rest to his Facebook link, tiny arrows nudging the chaos toward his door. I wasn't trying to ruin lives. I only wanted him to taste the friction of his own choices. That afternoon, his number went silent. Not a single message. That quiet had its own sound, a hollowed-out echo that told me something deeper was happening. If his phone had blown up, he wasn't answering, or maybe he'd realized the kind of attention he'd invited. Then the notifications started again, but different. They were angry, disappointed, mocking. Screenshots of conversations started appearing in group threads. Someone had posted his name with a caption that read, "PSA, don't accept offers from this guy scammer." And beneath it, laughing emojis. People were tagging him. Someone had copied my profile bio and pasted it on his wall as a comment. It was small, messy public shaming, not orchestrated by me, but cascading from what I'd started. I watched the last vestiges of his online persona disintegrate. His Facebook, the curated gallery of his bravado, was nuked. Posts disappeared. Photos vanished. Friends started unfriending. The guy who once posted shirtless gym selfies with captions like blessed now had an empty feed and an inbox full of contempt. I imagined him sitting there, his chest tightening with the same shame I had felt when strangers called me. The symmetry felt clean. A few days later, the nail in the coffin came in the form of a text from one of my old acquaintances, someone who knew both of us, but not the whole story. Hey, saw Derek's profile got deleted. He changed his number. Everything okay? The text was casual, conversational, but the subtext was loud. He'd been exposed and retreated into a smaller, quieter life. I reread the message, then put my phone down. My fingers trembled just a little. There was a moment, an odd, sticky, suspended moment, where I questioned the whole thing. I thought about calling his mom or apologizing to him in some run on catharsis. I thought about walking over to his small, dingy apartment, knocking on his thin door, and saying everything at once. You humiliated me. You gave me away. You treated my dignity like it was barter. You're pathetic. But I didn't. What I had wanted all along was not a scene. It was a quiet rebalancing. I wanted him to feel what I felt and maybe, just maybe, to rethink himself. In the weeks that followed, the fallout rippled. The people who had once laughed with him now kept distance. The small circle of enablers that had fed his ego scattered. He started showing up less at bars where he knew people. He declined invites. He stopped posting. Rumors reached me, grainy gossip at work and whispered conversations at mutual friend gatherings. Someone said he'd been seen leaving town for a week. Another said he'd gotten into a fight with a coworker and lost a shift. The details blurred, but the pattern was unmistakable. His confidence had eroded, and with it, his swagger. Watching that erosion took longer than I expected. Satisfying revenge isn't always instantaneous. Sometimes it's a slow, clever rot you set in motion and watch until it does its work. It felt like watering a plant and waiting for it to wither deliberate and oddly tender. Each week, when I scrolled past his name and saw fewer traces of him, I felt a weight lift, but the victory was not without its own costs. The power I'd tasted was intoxicating, and sometimes I caught myself indulging in it more than I wanted to. I would check his name online like a student who'd crammed for an exam and kept reopened tabs to see if the grade had changed. I had to remind myself that I'd asked for justice, not obsession. I had to remind myself that the person I used to be, the one who had sat and trembled at her phone, was not one I wanted to become again. Revenge had given me back something, but it also shown me how easily I could be consumed by the very hunger that had driven him. The real change, the part that surprised me, came later. Months after the deletion and the number change, when the immediate heat of the events had cooled into a domestic warmth, life rearranged itself. My mornings were no longer punctuated by terror at a strange number. I slept through nights. I said yes to things I'd been avoiding: coffee with friends, a weekend trip, a new gym class. I stopped flinching. My voice returned to the people around me in a way that felt solid. Revenge hadn't fixed everything. My sense of security had to be rebuilt slowly, by trust and new routines, but it had severed the acute terror like a curse lifted. Friends noticed the change. Priya hugged me like someone who'd been holding their breath while I walked a tightrope. You look like you again, she said once, half teasing, half relieved. And she was right. I'd reclaimed a version of myself that had been muffled by humiliation. The reclamation wasn't only about what I'd done to him. It was about what I'd done for myself, and that distinction mattered. There were consequences that lingered, though. I had learned how easy it was to weaponize anonymity. It frightened me. I became more cautious about the edges of my behavior, more aware of where the line between justice and cruelty lay. The night I dialed his number and let him squirm had felt like a triumph, but it also had taught me how close satisfaction sets to obsession. For a while, I checked myself, sometimes harshly, before I reveled too long in other people's discomfort. I learned to measure my victories, to hold them gently and not let them define me. Sometimes I ran into people who'd heard the half stories. Did you hear about Derek? One coworker asked months later, like it was a weather report. I would smile, careful, and say nothing. It felt petty to gloat. The work of healing, I realized, was not in telling the world what I'd done, but in living the life that made doing it unnecessary. And then, one quiet afternoon, I ran into him at the grocery store of all places. He was a shadow of himself, thinner, eyes a little hollowed, clutching a bag of chips like he needed something to hold on to. For a jolt, heat rose to my face and my heart lurched. I considered walking away. I considered saying something, anything, to remind him we'd both been actors in a small, ugly play. He looked up and recognized me. For a second, there was that old flash of arrogance. Then it faded into something awkward, strained. He mumbled an apology. It wasn't grand. It wasn't suffused with contrition. It was a tiny, likely reflex apology. Hey, sorry about before. I nodded. My mouth wanted to flay him, to recite the litany of every indignity. But I didn't. I felt something like pity and something like relief. He looked tired, like a man who'd learned an expensive lesson about the cheapness of his own bravado. Take care, I said, and that was the end of it. The exchange was small, but it was enough. I walked away lighter, as though a single thread had been cut. In the months after, I dated again cautiously, with better boundaries. I told people early what I needed and what I wouldn't tolerate. I cultivated a sort of armor made of small, practical things, a block list, privacy settings, friends who would call me immediately if they saw something off. I learned to guard my dignity like it was the fragile, expensive thing it is. Was it wrong? There were nights when I stared at the ceiling and asked myself that question, honest and demanding. I thought about his family, about his livelihood, about how easy it is for any of us to make a terrible choice in a second. I thought about the older woman whose message I'd blocked and wondered if my plan had, even unintentionally, toyed with people who were already vulnerable. Those doubts didn't erase my satisfaction. They complicated it. They taught me nuance. They reminded me that justice is not always clean and that revenge rarely is either. If I had to do it again, would I? The funny, surprising answer is maybe. Not because I relish hurting others, but because sometimes the world presents you with a single sharp injustice that demands a particular kind of response. He humiliated me in a way that felt intimate and corrosive. The world's usual mechanisms calling him out, filing a report, felt impotent. What I did was not noble. It was messy and human and small, and in its own peculiar way, restorative. I learned more from how I felt after it all than from the act itself. I learned that regaining your voice can require messy decisions. I learned that the appetite for power is an easy thing to inherit from the people who hurt you, and that's a dangerous legacy. I learned to be kinder in small ways to strangers who reached out with obvious needs, and firmer with the people who thought they could bargain with my dignity. In the end, I didn't dance on his ruins or post a victory lap. I lived my life. I made better choices. I kept a private satisfaction tucked like a talisman in my pocket, a warm, slightly ridiculous memory that flashed at odd moments and made me laugh. If you're listening to this and wondering whether revival of dignity requires vengeance, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it requires boundaries, therapy, conversations, and legal recourse. But sometimes people do cruel things that demand a response that feels like a rebalancing. If you choose to take matters into your own hands, be careful. Keep your humanity. Keep your evidence. Draw lines where you must. Justice for me didn't look like a courtroom victory. It looked like a quiet evening where my phone no longer made me flinch. where I could go grocery shopping without scanning every face, and where an ex who once thought he could commodify me became a man who had to live smaller and maybe think harder about how he treated others.